All right, everyone. This lecture is about stress and emotions. I know I mentioned in the attitudes module that while stress and emotions was covered in while emotions were covered in that module, that we would revisit it elsewhere. And it makes more sense to talk about it related to stress because our emotions play into our experience of stress. And while affective components can play a role in attitudes, it actually is more fitting for us to talk about it here. So, where does this all fit in? Well, here's just a reminder of what we're talking about in this half of the semester with stress and well being right here in the orange. So, it is just another topic that will help us understand the things that impact people's behavior in the workplace. So, what's not covered but is in the book, so things that I am not going to talk about in this lecture but do appear in the textbook include the sections on occupational health psychology and job loss. They just kind of detract from the narrative here a little bit, though they are important. So, you can definitely read those. I recommend reading about those, but I will not be covering it here. But first, before we actually get into a discussion of stress, which is what the textbook chapter assigned for this week is about, let's talk about emotions. So, emotions refer to these specific physiological cognitive responses. Emotions are actually very difficult to define because we all know what emotions are when we talk about them. These feelings of sadness, happiness, anger, frustration, those are all emotions. But what is an emotion? It's hard to describe it without saying what it is. It's an emotion, it's how I feel. That's just a synonym for feelings. I've heard some researchers describe emotions as being changes in physiological and cognitive readiness for action. I've heard some people describe it as that, which is, from a layman's perspective or a layperson's perspective, really hard to actually understand what what that means and what that translates into. In fact, what's really interesting is upon further perusal, I found that your textbook does not even provide a definition of emotions. Once again, because from a psychological perspective, it's really hard to define in a way that doesn't get into these terms and terminology that just adds more confusion to it. But hopefully you all know what emotions are. They are feelings. And I should note, and I think I've made this point earlier, emotions are different from thoughts. So having an opinion, feeling, when we talk about I feel this, or in there's this whole idea that in couples counseling or family counseling, that the way you have the conversation is you draw on I feel statements. And that can also add to some of the confusion about what emotions are, because usually I feel statements are about thoughts and opinions and beliefs. So I feel that you don't do enough dishes. That's not an emotion, that is a thought. So it's better to say, actually, I think or I believe. So emotions, though, remember, these are feelings. These are things like happiness, sadness, frustration. Those are all emotions. The things that you feel when you something changes in you. It's not just in your mind. You can feel it in your chest and your stomach. You can feel your pulse quicken. You can feel your stomach drop to the bottom of your feet. That's the experience of an emotion. And it's not a thought. Thoughts can generate emotions. We can recall, say, an embarrassing moment and be reminded and almost feel viscerally that embarrassment. The time you were walking in the dining hall and dropped everything in front of everyone. I know that we've all done that, and people started clapping. You can feel that with the embarrassment, and it tightens in your chest. That's an emotion. So your thoughts can produce emotions, or you can think about something that a significant other or a friend said that made you angry at the time, and it makes you angry to think about now. So the thought is not the emotion. The recollection of what made you angry is not an emotion. The emotion is the anger. It's that feeling. So that's what emotions are. Emotions are also specific. And when I say specific, what I mean is that when we have different words for different emotions, they refer to different experiences of those physiological reactions, so those physical reactions, as well as those patterns of thinking and the action readiness they produce. In other words, something like happiness is distinct from something like contentment. And contentment is different than malaise. And malaise is different than depression. And depression is different than anger. And depression there, I mean, in the emotional state, not the clinical diagnosis state. They are also event-based. So emotions are based on events. Like I said, we can think about times when we were embarrassed, and events produce emotions. Events produce embarrassment. Events produce our anger. So things happening produce our emotions. It's very unlikely that you would just feel an emotion without a memory of an event or the experience of an event to produce it. There are also many different kinds of emotions. So because they are specific and each specific label refers to a different experience of an emotion, there are therefore very many different emotions. And we'll show those in the next slide. They also produce different facial expressions, which I will show you after I take a brief pause here. So there are different facial expressions associated with different emotions. And what that means is that we can have, we can look at emotions and, or rather people expressing different facial forms and conclude what emotions they are experiencing. Of course, people conceal these all the time, but if we were to see someone exhibiting certain facial patterns, we would conclude reasonably that this person is feeling a certain way. So here we see this face, nose upturned, eyebrows kind of drawn, the face of disgust, right? You smell something bad, ugh. We all know that face. We all recognize it. And so when I see someone making that face, I know they are feeling disgust. If I see someone with their eyes wide, eyebrows up, almost a grimace in their face, that means they're scared or they're fearful. Sadness, we all know, a pout, downturned lips, furrowed eyebrows. These are all facial expressions that we can recognize. So what that means is that if someone's displaying certain facial features, I can actually reasonably conclude what they're feeling, unless they're very good at hiding their emotions, which we will talk about, I think, a little bit when we talk about emotional labor. They are also action-oriented. As I mentioned, some people define emotions as changes in your physiological state that orient you towards action, and that's because a lot of our emotions compel us to do something about them. Some people don't, and that can be problematic. But we do find that our emotions result in these different action or even avoidance-oriented states. So when we're feeling something like guilt, for example, we know that people feel compelled to do something about it. They want to resolve that guilt. And so we see them engage in things like pro-social behavior, donations, helping. With anger, when we see people experience anger, we find that, especially in organizations, they can engage in things like revenge, retribution, retaliation. So our emotions compel us to do something about them. There are also 4 other ways we can think about emotions. They are also experientially irreducible. So what that means is that it's really hard to break emotions down into their component parts. So I can't say that anger is a little bit of contentment plus a little bit of rage. They're still different. And you can't break them down. It's almost like when you get to the parts of an atom, and though with science progressing more and more, we're finding that we can break down parts of an atom even further than we thought we could. But if you get to, think, what is a quark? No, I feel like there's even something smaller than that. But once we get down to the finest particles of matter, we can't reduce it anymore. Emotions are the same. We can't break them down into any further component parts. They just are their own thing. They also involve a pleasantness-unpleasantness appraisal, which makes them very similar to attitudes. So emotions involve some sort of assessment or experience of something that's pleasant or pleasing or good, or something that's unpleasant or displeasing or not good. As I said, they result in physiological changes. These often relate to our nervous systems and our various responses that are almost, they're instinctive, they're ingrained. We can't really change that. We can't program ourselves. We can try. It's very hard though to deprogram ourselves of the way nature has built us to react with emotions to different events. And as I said, it prepares us for action, so we don't need to go over that again. So here are some examples of emotion families. Some people have tried to make sense, much like we make sense of personality traits with the big 5, some people have tried to make sense of how we can develop emotion families. Although these are still experientially irreducible, we can find some similarities. So here we have an anger family, which includes things like disgust, envy, exasperation, irritation, rage, and torment. Here we have fear, which includes things like alarm and anxiety. Here we have joy, which includes everything from relief to cheerfulness. Then we have love, which includes things like, yes, affection, but also lust and longing. Then we have sadness, which includes things like sympathy, I guess is actually a form of sadness, neglect, disappointment, and then surprise. Surprise really doesn't have its own subcluster, unless I guess you could include maybe things like astonishment in there. But these are just some ways that you can understand, okay, I don't really quite get what an emotion is. These are all different kinds of emotions right here. So it is affect, or affect, for the record, is a synonym for just in general emotional experiences, including mood as well as emotions. And it's not the same as job satisfaction, and it's not really even the same as an attitude. So attitudes, much like emotions and affect generally, are evaluative constructs. Remember, I mentioned that emotions involve basically this appraisal or evaluation of whether something is pleasant or unpleasant. Attitudes are the same, and indeed, we could even draw an arrow here where affect, emotions, impact our attitudes or are part of our attitudes. But for the purposes of this, we just know that they are both evaluative constructs. Affect then gets broken down into mood, which we'll talk about in a bit, stress, we will also talk about in a bit, and then emotions, which we have just covered. So what then is mood? Mood, unlike emotions, is very diffuse. So it's very, it's not very intense, and it's not very specific. We basically break moods down into good moods and bad moods. And this is one place in psychology where the commonplace description of something is actually consistent with how we think about it in psychology and IO psychology. So remember, I said good attitude, bad attitude, good personality, bad personality. Those things don't really exist in IO psychology. But mood, good mood, bad mood, or rather positive mood and negative mood, those are things that do exist in psychology as we understand them. Mood also tends to be long lasting. This isn't something that I brought up in my slide on emotions, but emotions tend to be pretty quick. Sometimes you can still experience anger after the fact, but eventually over time, your anger dissipates, or you get distracted, or you move on. Mood, though, this can last with you for days. Emotions, though, that really intense feeling of anger, you can't sustain it. You also can't sustain an intense feeling of sadness for a really long time. Most people can't anyway. And so mood in that way is long lasting. Like I said, days. Emotions are usually minutes, hours, maybe a day at most. They're also very general. So like I said, there's positive mood and negative mood. There aren't more specific moods than that. When we get more specific, then we're dealing with emotions. There are no distinct facial expressions. So I can't look at someone and say that person's in a bad mood by looking at their face. And mood also leads to cognitions. So your emotions led you to action. Your mood leads you more to thoughts and impacts your thoughts more. In that way, it can result in something known as rumination. Rumination is where you're constantly thinking about something and turning it over your head and churning it over in your head. We often think about this with negative mood, or a bad mood, where people are constantly thinking about negative things that happened to them and bad things, or the event that produced the negative emotions that led to their negative mood. So whereas your emotions compel you to act, your mood leads you to think a little bit more, and in ways that are consistent with that mood. So you're not going to be in a negative mood and start thinking about good things unless you do it intentionally. Okay, so the major differences between emotions and mood: emotions have an object, so that means they have an event that specifically produces them. Moods don't. And diffuseness. So this gets into this idea that emotions are very specific and can't be reducible, and they're unique, and moods are very general, non-specific. And I think that's how I would characterize that. I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting one other thing. Now, I will note really quickly that your emotions can lead to a mood, in the sense that when you experience something that, say, produces anger or sadness, eventually that sadness and anger will fade and just leave you with a negative mood. So that's how emotions and moods are related to each other. But I will note that Theoretically, your mood could translate into an emotion if you start to recall the event that led to it. So for instance, if you're in a negative mood and you go home and your significant other, your parent says, hey, why are you in this mood? What's going on? And you would say, I don't know. And they're like, well, did anything happen? And then you remember, oh, I got a bad grade back in one of my classes. Then maybe we could argue that your mood is now turned into a very weak emotion because you've remembered what caused your mood. That's a theoretical idea that some psychologists have put forth. So these things are related. That's really the takeaway here, is that these things are related to each other. So generally speaking, then we have, as I mentioned, positive and negative mood, or positive and negative affect. And this is more often than not how we talk. If we're not talking about specific emotions in the workplace, we are then talking about generally positive and negative affect. These refer to mood dimensions or even emotion dimensions that describe multiple similar emotions that people can experience. Positive affect being things like being elated, happy, pleased, satisfied, calm, etc. over here, and negative emotions including things from being depressed to actively upset or angry. So one of the reasons we make this distinction, because yes, we can measure people on what's known as their state. Do we go to state over here? I'm just trying to say, no, their state negative affect. So we can ask them, in general, are you experiencing these emotions right now? We can also ask them about, and so we could do this with, negative and positive emotional states, or negative and positive affect. But we can also ask them about their tendencies to experience different emotions, which we briefly touched on in our attitude section. So there is a difference between state and trait affect. What I talked about just now was state affect, where we ask people about how are you feeling right now. That is a different, though related, question to how do you feel in general, right? Because how you feel right now may not be how you typically feel on your average day or just across various situations. And I mentioned this earlier, especially in talking about neuroticism, that some people have different tendencies to experience emotions, different types of emotions in different scenarios. People who are neurotic tend to experience negative emotions and a little bit more strongly than people who are low in neuroticism. So this is a related idea. And some people would even argue that negative affectivity, what's listed right here, is effectively neuroticism, that these are very much, if not the same, very much similar, if not the same thing. So negative affectivity refers to an individual difference. So like I said, this is not how you are feeling in a situation, but how you feel over multiple scenarios and multiple days and over time. Negative affectivity refers to feeling diverse negative mood states or negative emotions. So things like anxiety, guilt, depression. Another term we use for negative affectivity is trait negative affect. We therefore also have the opposite, or rather the corollary, because you can experience both of these. You can actually be high on both of these, or demonstrate both positive and negative affectivity. Positive affectivity is where you experience diverse positive mood states frequently. So you're cheerful, you're enthusiastic, you're energetic. Much like some people believe that negative affectivity is very similar, if not identical, to neuroticism, many people, being researchers, feel that positive affectivity is similar to, if not identical to, extroversion, because part of extroversion also includes the experience of positive emotional states. I should note that these are not opposites of each other. You can have people who score low on both. You can have people who are pretty affectively muted. They just don't experience very many emotions, be they positive or negative at all. So those people would be low in negative affectivity and low in positive affectivity, or as I said, we also call this trait positive and trait positive affect and trait negative affect. You can also have people who are who score very high on both of these. And we might observe this in people who have bipolar tendencies, for example. This, of course, would not be an assessment of clinical bipolar disorder, but that's where we would see this potentially. So what have we talked about that relates to all this? Well, remember, we talked about that job satisfaction can be pretty stable. And I noted in the module on attitudes that twin studies, so those studies that looked at twins who were separated, identical twins separated at birth, who were reared in different homes, found that those individuals had similar levels of job satisfaction. And so recall that there might be a genetic component, therefore, to job satisfaction. The idea is that job satisfaction, or rather, the individual differences that can lead to consistencies in job satisfaction might have a genetic basis. And here we believe that this manifests in trait positive and trait negative affect, that there is some sort of genetic basis for our tendency to experience positive and negative emotions. And that when people who are, say, high on trait positive affect go into a workplace, they are going to experience more positive emotions because of what they bring into the workplace. And so those people are therefore more likely to attribute those positive emotions not to themselves, but to their work, or conclude, well, I'm happy very often when I'm at work. It must be because I enjoy my work. The same also goes for negative affectivity or trait negative affect, but in the opposite way, that people who tend to experience negative emotions will therefore conclude that it's their work that's making them unhappy or making them depressed or making them angry. Another reason that we might see that people who are high in trait negative affect may experience, or another reason we may see that those people experience less job satisfaction, is because their negative emotions may also alienate them from their coworkers. They may make them more difficult to work with. And so in that way, they're also losing out on that valuable experience of developing social connections that could lead to more satisfaction in the workplace. They also react more extremely. So because of this tendency to experience negative emotions, much like we talked about with neuroticism, they also tend to, when bad things happen, react even more negatively than other people. And so in that way, this is why we may see that people who are high in trait negative affect may experience less job satisfaction overall. So let's talk about emotions at work. So we do find from research that there are effects of day of the week that over time negative affect does decrease. So we're talking about from Monday to Friday. So we find that your negative affect does decrease. Basically, as you get closer to the weekend, you don't feel as many negative emotions. On Monday, you feel a lot of negative emotions, and that your positive affect increases. And this makes sense that as you get closer to the weekend and the end of the work week, you start to experience more positive emotions. There are also effects of time of day. So your negative affect tends to remain pretty stable throughout the workday. So that means that your negative emotions just tend to be about the same throughout the day. Your positive affect, what some research shows is that it increases. So your positive emotions increase, they peak, and then they drop toward the end of the day. But there are, of course, individual differences. Some of us may show different patterns, and it is probably related a lot to the work that we do. That, someone who teaches in the morning, for example, may find that they get, a high off of, teaching, and then it just drops very suddenly. Whereas someone, if they teach at the end of the day, their day may get better over time as they start to build up to teaching. And if they enjoy it, if the opposite could also be true. If you don't enjoy teaching, you could start off with a very low negative emotional experience and then build up as the day goes on. So there are individual differences, not only in terms of what kind of work you're doing, but what kind of person you are and whether you enjoy the work that you're doing and the tasks that you do throughout the day. Some other research has also shown that if we look at people's emotional experiences and we ask them multiple times throughout the day and throughout the week, what are you experiencing? We tend to find that people experience a mildly positive mood and mildly positive emotions. So that's a good thing. That generally we're finding that people's emotional states are mildly positive. However, there are also findings from other studies that show that when we're looking at work, that people do report experiencing more positive events at work. But what we do find is that the effect of negative events on your mood is 5 times stronger than positive events. And this makes sense to a lot of us who have been out and working in the world, and even just in your own experience as a student, that when something bad happens, you probably experience stronger emotions and for way longer probably than if something good were to happen. I've seen this in my own research on fairness, that people react very strongly to being treated unfairly and react just like it's normal life if they're treated fairly. So it's the same here. And for those of you who plan on becoming managers, this is really important to know, because you will find yourself at some point in time saying, I don't know what to do with these people. I treat them so well. I do so many good things for them. But the moment one bad thing happens, forget about it. They're gone, they're upset, they're angry, and it seems like there's nothing I can do to make up for it. And this is why, because negative events just tend to affect us way more than positive events. So we do find also that trait positive and trait negative affect do impact employees' behaviors and outcomes at work. So this might be something that you may actually be interested in assessing, assuming that it's actually something that we can legally assess. So it can impact job performance and performance appraisals. I put this in bold, and I think I've mentioned this elsewhere as a joke, which some of my students appreciate and some of my students do not. But I'm always trying to integrate this into what it means for you as a student as well as your professors, and show you in real life what this relates to. So research shows that our emotions influence our evaluations of other people. And so this happens at work. Namely, if you're doing a performance appraisal, you do not want to be in either a particularly positive or a particularly negative emotional state, because that can bias your reviews either to be more positive than they should be or more negative than they should be. So for example, if your professor is in a negative emotional state, you probably don't want him or her grading your papers, because it's going to carry over, especially if they're not aware of it, especially if they aren't aware that they are experiencing a negative mood, or if they're not aware that their negative mood will impact their performance appraisal. The same goes for a manager. If your manager is in a bad mood and you have a performance appraisal scheduled for that day, reschedule it, because assuming that the performance appraisal hasn't already been done. But you really don't want to be on the receiving end of someone's negative mood and negative emotions when you're having your performance appraised. And so I brought this up with grading the assignment, that a stressful state and a negative emotional state would potentially impact grading. And I usually, like I said, I make some point at every point in the semester to highlight this with my students. When I taught a few years ago, and it was face-to-face, some of my students brought me candy after we went over this right before I was going to grade their midterms, which I just thought was the most hilarious thing that has ever happened in the history of me teaching, because they knew candy would put me in a good mood before I was going to grade. So it's those sorts of things I tell you, not because, and the opposite does happen, where students think I'm threatening to grade based on my mood, which I absolutely would not, we just never do. It's more to illustrate that moods impact performance appraisals, and people like me who are educated on it and know it, we try to prevent ourselves from ever grading when we're either in a very generous and positive mood or when we're in a very negative mood, because we want our grading to reflect the performance of the student and not the moods we carry into our grading, not the moods we carry into the classroom or our offices. And the same should go for managers. When you're a manager, you should have the insight and the emotional intelligence to identify when you are experiencing negative emotions, because it can impact how you evaluate and how you interact with your employees. And usually, for the record, we're focusing this more on negative emotional states, but positive emotional states too. You don't want to be in a situation where you're refusing or unable to acknowledge your employee's poor performance because you're in a generous mood and a positive mood, and it's carrying over into your performance evaluations. We also find that trait positive and negative affect impact things like OCB, CWBs, withdrawal, and creativity. So we've already talked about personality. I won't go into that in terms of neuroticism and extroversion, but generally what we find is what you would expect. People who demonstrate high levels of trait positive affect, they just tend to perform better, engage in more OCBs, fewer CWBs. They're less likely to withdraw, and they're more creative. On the other hand, we find the opposite for trait negative affect, which is not surprising. At work, though, we can't always display our emotions. As I mentioned, professors, managers, anybody who's experiencing an emotional state that they believe may impact their jobs may have to engage in something known as emotion regulation, where we try to regulate the impact of our emotions on our behaviors and on ourselves. So we may try to influence our emotions. That's what emotion regulation is. We basically are just trying to regulate and change our emotions. So we would influence our emotions through maybe how or when we experience them, how we experience them. So how strongly am I experiencing them? Back to the when. Maybe I'm just going to say, okay, get through this class, get through this meeting, get through this presentation, and then I will deal with these emotions later. Or even, so how do you feel them too? So trying to minimize the extent to which I feel an emotion, and expression, keeping it inside versus expressing it to other people, showing that I am angry, showing that I am frustrated, or showing that I'm happy when I shouldn't be. So you can do this, you can influence the expression and the experience of your emotions by modification as well. So you can change the inputs. So for example, you may try to reappraise the situation that's leading you into your negative emotional state. So let's say that you got into a car accident on the way to work. This has happened to me. It's happened to a lot of people. And you know that you have a meeting, you know that you have to teach class, you know that you have to have a presentation at some point. So you may modify your inputs. Though the car accident is making you upset and you're angry and it wasn't your fault and you're angry at the other driver, you may say, you know what, I am lucky to be alive. A lot of people die from car accidents and I'm just lucky to be here. So you change the input, you change the thing that is producing your emotion. So you either change your appraisal of it, you try to understand it differently, and you do that to change the emotion that you're experiencing. So I may go from feeling anger to gratitude. You can also try to change your response. So I might say, look, the car accident sucked. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. I'm not going to try to see the silver lining, but I can try to calm myself. I can try to minimize my anger. I can do some breathing exercises. I can try to do some yoga. I can listen to a podcast that will make me feel better, or a stand-up comedy routine that always makes me laugh. So in that way, I may try to modify my response. So the emotion that I'm experiencing, not what I'm understanding of what's produced the emotion, but what I'm actually feeling. One downside to emotion regulation, though, is that if we engage in suppression, so our response to dealing with the expression of our emotions or our emotional response is to just, put it in a box, put it away, and don't deal with it. That can lead to a lot of buildup, and eventually it comes out. Eventually it negatively impacts the person, and it can result in a lot of problems. So suppression is not a good thing. Though workplaces certainly encourage it, right? They certainly encourage you, especially if any of you have worked in customer service. I know I have. If anybody has ever come in and is rude to you or just off-putting, you're encouraged to just put your emotions off to the side and wait till you're done dealing with the customer. But that involves a lot of suppression and a lot of regulation, basically telling yourself not to feel what you want to feel. And that can be really taxing on people over time. So one way that organizations, and we'll talk about this a little bit about stress things that people have been trying to do, stress trainings and interventions. We also have emotion regulation training. So this is another thing organizations try to do, teach their employees how to appropriately regulate their emotions, things that we've identified through research that are adaptive approaches to having to deal with these times when our emotions are inconsistent with how we feel, which gets us also to a concept known as emotional labor. So emotional labor refers specifically to enhancing, faking, or suppressing emotions to modify the emotional expression. And I should add, usually here we specifically note that this is when it's done as part of your job or for a wage, which is different than emotional regulation, which can happen both in and outside of work. Emotional labor also usually focuses on the fact that certain jobs have specific display rules. So whereas something like emotional regulation may happen more in response to norms and general expectations of human behavior and human emotions that happen in the workplace, we note when we're talking about emotional labor that jobs often have specific expectations that are outlined regarding how employees will act in work. We often talk about emotional labor in things like service industries, because as many of us know from working in service industries, you are told either explicitly or through on-the-job training how you were supposed to be emotionally, that you are always supposed to be working with a smile, that you're always supposed to emphasize that the customer is right, even if they say the most abhorrent things and treat you very poorly. And we see this in very extreme places as well. Customer service, usually we have to be very positive and smiling. And even if someone comes in and says, this is the worst food I've ever had, and throws it at you, you have to say, well, how can I make that better, ma'am? Would you like me to get a manager? You have to say that with a smile, or at least not get angry that someone has thrown food at you. We have the other extreme where you have to be very negative or at least stoic in the Buckingham Palace Guard. So those are those guys with big tall hats outside of Buckingham Palace who can't break. They can't show a smile. They can't, if someone gets up in their face, they can gently push them away, but they can't say anything. If a person insults their mother, they can't say anything. They just have to sit there and take it. And so that is almost the opposite. A funeral director is, you know, another person who has to at least display some level of remote, or they have to be morose. That's the word I was looking for. They have to be morose, not necessarily depressed, very just muted affect, and sad. They have to not pretend, but act sad and show sympathy to people who are dealing with some of the hardest things they've ever had to deal with. And so we end up getting in the emotional labor literature, though this is a flawed approach, but it is what we tend to talk about. We get into two concepts: surface acting and deep acting. These are based on dramaturgical understandings of acting. So basically drawing on what we know about stage actors and how they perform plays, how they perform roles, how they prepare and work to act. And so surface acting is when we, on the surface, fake emotions that we don't feel, display emotions on the outside that we don't feel. And we're just basically, though we may be seething and screaming inside, we are smiling at the customer who just threw a plate of pasta at us because it wasn't that good. On the other hand, we have deep acting. Deep acting is where we actually try to make ourselves feel the emotions we're supposed to display. So make yourself feel happy. Make yourself at least feel content when you're supposed to. So those are the two different approaches that result when we have to deal with emotional labor. Surface acting, generally, we find that it doesn't have a good impact on people, that the just fake it till you make it approach doesn't work well for employees in the long run in terms of the impact it has on the employee. Some research, I think, also shows that customers can pick up on it when you're faking. Deep acting, we tend to find, does a little bit better in terms of employee outcomes as well. So when we're actually trying to experience the emotions, that feeling of authenticity may lend itself to better employee outcomes. So I'm going to stop here and end the video here before we go into the next section where we talk about stress.